I personally do not trust someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, a proven bigot and anti-Semite, on the issues of what is good for Gazans and Israelis.
Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know it's...
All right, so AOC did this talk with David Axelrod. Not sure why. It's kind of a weird look, but I guess he has something to do with the Department of Politics at University of Chicago, and that's where she did this talk. So he's just the one hosting it, I suppose. And she's been popping up in a few different places lately, getting her message out, talking, hinting about runs in 2028. At least that's what she keeps getting asked about everywhere that she goes. And she finds ways to dodge the question or fold it back into some larger message, which she does quite well here, and has been going somewhat viral for her answer to the question of whether she plans to run for president, whether she plans to run for the Senate. So we'll get to all that. This is also in the context of a pretty major setback for the Democrats in Virginia, where their Supreme Court in the state of Virginia overturned the recent referendum that was passed for redistricting in Virginia, which probably would have netted the Democrats a few more seats in the House, or at least gave them a better chance. So it's a setback on that and puts Republicans back on the front foot going into the midterm. So it's not exactly clear where things are at with that yet. Democrats apparently plan to appeal. So we'll get to all that later. AOC also had some comments about working across the aisle with Republicans and whatnot when she was asked about it. So here's the first clip where David Axelrod first asks her about the referendum in Virginia, and they talk about gerrymandering in general, and then they get into the questions about whether she's going to run for Senate or for president.
Somewhere here, David Wasserman from the Cook Report is here. I think they today switched between Florida, which is redistricting, Tennessee, which is redistricting after the Voting Rights Act was struck down, Section 2. And then what happened in Virginia today, they moved 12 races from toward the Republicans. 4 or 5 of them were strongly Democrat and swung to the Republicans. First of all, how concerned are you about that relative to November? But where do you think this whole redistricting war is going to go?
Well, I mean, I'm tremendously concerned about it with respect to our country. The courts have been hijacked. The courts have been hijacked by conservative activists, and this is not, they have completely abdicated themselves from even the pretense of objectivity or their original goal or intent. And
in fairness, there were legal issues associated with this, and everybody knew it from the beginning that it was a kind of a close call because of what the law required, the steps that were necessary to get this done.
Well, let's talk about some of this for a little bit. First of all, let's zoom out. Redistricting in Tennessee, North Carolina, Texas, Florida, Missouri, none of that challenged or overturned by the courts, despite very clear and brazen constitutional violations, such as in the state of Florida, right? But that, you know, they've bought their courts, and so it's not going through. But what the difference is here in the state of Virginia is that all those other states I just listed, those maps were passed by their state legislatures. Virginia was an election of 3 million Americans. This court did not overturn a map, it overturned an election.
There are a lot of people who would like you to run for president in 2028. Apparently some of them are here. And there are people who, there are others who would like you to run for the United States Senate. Senator Schumer's up in 2028. What say you about all of this?
You know, it's funny because in this op-ed that Jeff Bezos paid for in the Washington Post, there was this line that you had mentioned earlier about, well, as a potential 2028 contender, XYZ. And in the context of that, it was very clear this was a veiled threat, right? So it was the elite saying, if you want this job, you just stepped out of line. And we want you to know where the real power is. And it's in the modern day barons who own the post and own the algorithms, and we'll make an example out of you. And what's funny about that is that they assume that my ambition is positional. They assume that my ambition is a title or a seat. And my ambition is way bigger than that. My ambition is to change this country. And presidents come and go, Senate, House seats, elected officials come and go, but single-payer health care is forever. A living wage is forever. Workers' rights are forever. Women's rights, all of that.
The redistricting issue is genuinely troubling. Essentially, their Supreme Court overturned the results of the election where voters approved the redistricting. The Supreme Court did that. The Supreme Court of Virginia did that on the basis that by the time they put the referendum on the ballot to be voted for, the election had technically already started, because it starts like a period of 2 weeks before the actual election day or something like that. So because of that technicality, the Virginia Supreme Court effectively says that that invalidates the entire thing. So there's not that many options for Democrats after that point. They're going to try to appeal that decision with the Virginia Supreme Court. From what I'm hearing, there's not that much of a case they could make at a federal level, not much of anywhere to go, which in the case that people are mentioning in Ohio, where Republicans defied the Supreme Court specifically on an issue of redistricting, what that was a federal court decision that had been made above the head of the Ohio Supreme Court that was telling the Republicans they had to approve a new voter map after the one that they had asked the Ohio Supreme Court to approve. Now that same map got approved by the federal Supreme Court, so they felt that they just had to wait out the clock on the Ohio Supreme Court's order to approve a different map so that they could stick with the map that they liked in the first place. So this isn't quite the same situation. In other words, I don't see the recourse. I don't see what the process of defying this court order would be, even though some people like Graham Plattner have called for that. And I think if there is any way to do that, they should. And I don't know enough about the nuts and bolts of how something like this is applied, but there's probably some way that they could continue to push it if they want to, and I do think that's the right move. And really, this is where Democrats have to radicalize, because it is a power grab from Republicans, and these are power grabs back and forth. There's no doubt about it. But seeing Republicans entrench power in a moment like this could essentially create the conditions that secure minority rule in America for, a long time. And that's really always been one of the core threats of the Trump administration and Trump's empowerment. Trump's way of empowering the Republican Party is empowering them to knock down enough of these norms of our democracy that they can take an unconstitutional amount of power. And Trump, wanting to run for a third term, as for example, and trying to find a way to do that would be the ultimate example of what they are going to try to do in the midterms, which is rig things enough that Democrats can't take back control. So that would be the worst case scenario, because that would give Trump the next couple years to do what he wants leading into the next election. Hard to see how we would recover from that. So we're not there yet. And, I suspect that more things will happen in this chain of events. I think that Democrats need to start playing dirty. It annoys me that every time there's like a convenient last minute development, or somebody dies on the stand or disappears or switches parties at the last minute, it's always something that benefits Republicans and not Democrats. Democrats never seem to be the ones that have dirt on a judge or, have some way of rat fucking the Supreme Court. And, we're getting to that point. And this is the same thing I was saying during Biden's administration when Manchin came up. The only thing that you can do in a situation with a guy like Manchin is undercut the leverage that he's utilizing against the president. Because unless you find a way that is frankly illegitimate of forcing him to do what you want him to do, then you effectively don't have any power over him at all. And so the only way to maintain power in the executive, especially when there's these like existential fights happening, is you have to find those extrajudicial methods of extracting leverage over people. With Manchin, it was the fact that his companies were vulnerable to being investigated and prosecuted. And so being able to fudge the rules in order to use leverage over people like that is kind of how the game of politics has always worked. And Democrats do engage in that. They just never do it at a high profile enough level that it actually secures these major wins for them. And, I think that if the party and the base behind the party doesn't radicalize now, then it's possible we'll see a true Democratic backslide, which will put us in much different territory in terms of what's the way out of this. So we're not quite there yet, but the type of pushback that is needed in a moment like this would be similar to the type of pushback that they got over ICE, for example, and various issues that have actually caused the administration to be, rocked back on their heels a little bit. And what that looks like is people being angry enough that the criticism and the same complaints about the same thing that's happening start bubbling up in different areas of the discourse. People start talking about it at work, it's on the internet, it's going viral, it's being talked about on TV, and as well as those messages and that anger being directed towards elected representatives and, public forums for these things to be talked about, city council meetings, any outlet for civil engagement. Especially in Virginia, there needs to be a grassroots level pushback to this that creates a cultural pushback. And that's the only thing that is going to change the conditions that this Supreme Court is in when it is going to be answering to the appeal that is inevitably going to be filed by Democrats. Does that make sense? So they need to be existing in conditions of maximum pressure, because if not, then they're just going to reaffirm their own decisions. However, if they are under maximum pressure and members of the court are being pressured in various ways that we as the public don't need to know, as well as the backlash from the public spilling over the usual lines of controlled discourse to becoming a more unstable and volatile situation. That's what makes people in power start to get afraid and start to feel like they have to capitulate to the demands that they're hearing, even if they're trying to hold out. If they start to hear it kind of like breaking through the walls a little bit, the walls that usually protect them, that's when they're going to start getting nervous and realizing that they might have to reverse course. As far as AOC running for president, I think she gives a good answer on this. It's about the dedication to the issues and about making the country better. And this thing about single payer is forever. It's a nice, cute little line. She's obviously playing to her audience with this crowd here. There's no doubt about it. But I do like that line because that is the kind of thing that I've been thinking about, is you have this push and pull of Democrats and Republicans, and Democrats make reforms, Republicans sabotage them, then Republicans do away with them completely, and then Democrats do a half reform in response to that. And it's just nothing ever gets done, and we're lost in this push and pull between austerity and like mild social democratic policy. And so how do you institute programs that are permanent, something like Social Security, single payer healthcare, or even Medicaid and Medicare, where they get fiddled with one way or the other? But specifically in the case of Social Security, it's kind of this untouchable third rail of politics where when it comes to the money that actually goes out to people, you don't touch that. And so once you institute those programs and the programs go out to people directly, make a tangible difference on their lives, stabilize people's lives, that is what gives you the permanence. Because whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or whoever else, if you're depending on those voters to put you in power, even if they voted you in on an austerity platform, you can't touch the programs that they depend on. And so if that program is delivered to people based on a genuine basis of need, this is what people need as the floor underneath them, a basic social safety net. And without this, people will fall into destitution. That's how you create a permanent program, because once people have that, they will understand that they're entitled to that for a reason. So that's the right kind of politics going forward. I think that there are many, many gains that can be made in America with that type of attitude. There are plenty of Republican voters who believe in that sort of thing, or at least can be convinced to agree with that sort of thing, and certainly aren't going to complain too much if these programs happen in a way that benefit their lives. So that being said, AOC was asked here later in this conversation about collaborations that she has done with Republicans in the past, like getting a ban on stock trading passed, and was asked how she squares that with comments she's made in the past about Republicans, as well as her talking a little bit about the issue of Israel and Palestine and how she feels about right-wingers on that issue.
Representative Ocasio-Cortez, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. In 2021, you stated that there were, quote, legitimate white supremacist sympathizers at the core of the House of Representatives caucus. Yet since then, in efforts to ban congressional insider trading of securities, you've worked across the aisle with representatives such as Representative Tim Burchett, a Republican from the state of Tennessee. Do you stand by those former comments, and do you think that they make bipartisanship harder? And furthermore, how have your views on bipartisanship evolved over your last 6 years in Congress?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I do stand by those comments. It's just true. And for his part, you know, Congressman Burchett has called me a communist and a witch and whatever it is. And but you know what? We got to ban insider trading in Congress. I personally do not trust someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, a proven bigot and anti-Semite, on the issues of what is good for Gazans and Israelis. I don't think that it benefits our movement in that instance to align the left with white nationalists. I don't think it serves us. And so I think it's about looking at the context, the place, the results, the outcomes, intentions, and where we think that train would go. But as far as what someone says about me, I could care less. And, you know, I think it's really about what our outcomes are. And to be honest, there are some areas where things will not get done if they're partisan because they are anti-establishment. There is bipartisan consensus on keeping and protecting stock trading in Congress. And so it's going to require a massive bipartisan consensus of people willing to come together across those differences to get it done.
Yeah, so I'll be honest, there's a little bit of a contradiction here because on the issue of Israel and Palestine, that is also an incredibly bipartisan ingrained issue. So I could certainly be convinced that that can be fixed and, you know, Israel can be cut off without bipartisan support. It's not exactly obvious that that's how that's going to happen right now, especially with how things are going currently in terms of what the makeup of the Congress and Senate might be after these midterms, which was being discussed earlier in this conversation. You know, it's not clear that Democrats are going to be able to do anything at all without some Republican support. And so while something like banning stock trading or, you know, compromises on Epstein or whatever might come out of that, and maybe some compromises about Israel and Palestine, because there is a little bit of consensus on that, cutting off arms to them, possibly even sanctions. There are definitely Republicans who would be open to that, and certainly if it becomes a referendum issue among Democrats and Republicans in this next midterms, then there will probably be even more members who are open to that going forward. So the truth is, unless Democrats are able to pull out some mechanism of still sweeping this election or just way overperform, which is possible, I suppose, then, you know, doing something serious on the issue of Israel-Palestine for somebody like AOC is probably going to require collaboration across that aisle. So I get why she went for saying that in this moment, because she wants to distinguish people like Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the things that they're saying about Israel. She wants to distinguish that from people who actually have their eye on the ball and have a meaningful change in the relationship between the United States and Israel in mind, and wants to separate that from the anti-Semitism that does come from and inevitably will come from those people, as well as just spiritual Christian nationalism, which is going to make it impossible to not empower some strain of, you know, nationalism and fascism in the country by collaborating with them. However, there literally might be no choice if you're trying to create meaningful change in the chambers of Congress that she's in, given the conditions that we're looking at. So we'll see in the coming days what the reaction is going to be like, to this latest development on the part of Republicans and Democrats. I do not think this is over. I think there's going to be more to this. They are going to appeal this in the Virginia Supreme Court. Like I said, they don't have that much reason to look at it any differently unless somebody, someone gives them a reason to. So hopefully something like that will happen. Democrats don't really seem to be able to fight that way, but this is now starting to get into territory where black people's voting rights throughout the country are being stripped away. Throughout the South, the South is going about aggressive redistricting. So that's the kind of thing that does lead to intense pushback in society at large. You're just pushing towards conditions that could be genuinely destabilizing. So we'll see what the reaction to that will be. The Democratic voter base has not been super reactive on some of this stuff, like the overturning of Roe versus Wade. But then with the killing of Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good, you saw some genuine movement from the American people that forced some pressure on those in power in a way that we're still tangibly seeing a difference in policy there. So we'll see what happens going forward. It's not over, but Democrats are definitely going to have to get more warlike if they want to survive this next midterm season.